My name is Dr. Chris Wilson. I'm a psychologist and the director of Being Trauma Informed. In this video, we'll be looking at vicarious trauma in the age of working remotely, starting with what is vicarious trauma, and then discussing some of the research on vicarious trauma, and finally, looking at what you can do to build your resilience, which, probably not surprising, needs to be a daily endeavor. So, you're going to notice that in this video, we are focusing exclusively on vicarious trauma and not burnout or compassion fatigue, which often can be confused with vicarious trauma, but that confusion is beyond the scope of this video. So, how do we define vicarious trauma? Well, it is literally having the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder resulting from prolonged exposure to the trauma of others. So you experience symptoms like avoiding a case or cases, not wanting to read the files, not wanting to make phone calls or return phone calls related to those cases. You may experience dreams or nightmares related to the case material. You may not be able to get certain images or related thoughts out of your head. You may find that with friends, you're discussing certain aspects of the case, obviously not giving away any confidential or private information, but discussing things that are related to the case at times when you'd be rather talking about hobbies or things that you enjoy, or you find yourself no longer enjoying things that you've enjoyed in the past. So you're not golfing as often, you're not knitting as often, you're not, if you're a bird watcher, going out and doing bird watching. Whatever it is your hobbies are, you're just not enjoying them in the same way. You may have trouble sleeping. You may have trouble falling asleep. You may also find yourself sleeping more than you normally do. You could even find yourself feeling more highly irritable or feeling more highly emotional. And these are all symptoms of potentially having vicarious trauma. Now, the reason I don't focus on actually meeting the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder is because it's really not about reaching a certain limit or criteria. It's about simply suffering. So even if you have only one of these symptoms, your life is being disrupted. So why is it that our lives get disrupted in these ways? Well, the research on attorneys and judges is pretty clear cut. It's about prolonged exposure to trauma. Has less to do with what you're doing to take care of yourself or your history. Maybe you have a trauma history or not. It seems to be all about the longer you're exposed to trauma, the more likely you are to suffer from vicarious trauma. So, we don't have research that tells us exactly why that is, but we do have some science that can help us make sense of those findings. And that science relates to two particular topics, and the first is the notion of resonance. So, if I show you this photograph, you probably have a reaction to it somewhere on a continuum of, oh, kitties, to, I'm not really a cat person, actually, like, ugh. And you may fall in between, right? You may not have much of a reaction. And then if I show you this photograph, right? Oh, puppies, right? But if you're a cat person, maybe you're not a dog person, vice versa. The bottom line is, resonance is about having associations, positive, negative, neutral. And it's also interesting to note that if you don't have an association, so for example, if I show you this photograph and you don't know what the Supreme Court is, then you're not going to resonate one way or another. You're not going to notice that you have a reaction. So what's interesting about this is that human beings, for the most part, all resonate, have a mental map, an association with emotional pain. So all human beings have resonance with sadness, hurt, pain, whether they're infants, whether they're adults, whether they're children, whether they're teens. For the most part, we have this ability to resonate, and we appear to do it automatically. And that appears to be due to our brain's ability to mirror. So this second piece of the science is about our brain's ability to mirror movement. So check out this photograph. If you're a golfer, your brain just fired as though you were swinging a golf club. Or this one. If you've ever done yoga, your brain just fired like you just did warrior pose, even though you're sitting right here in front of a computer watching this video. Now, it's even more interesting to think about the fact that you just have to be familiar with the movement. So they've shown ballerinas pictures of individuals engaged in martial arts, and the ballerinas, because the movement of martial artists is similar to that of ballerinas, the ballerinas' brains fired as though they were engaged in the same movement. How does this relate to you and vicarious trauma? Well, what is facial expression? It's muscle movement. And we're familiar with just about every facial expression out there. And how is tone of voice expressed? Well, muscle movement. Again, larynx, throat. So as we see faces and listen to voices experiencing pain, our brains fire as though we are experiencing that pain. So to a large degree, it's just inevitable that the longer we're exposed to trauma, the longer we're exposed to that pain, the more likely we are to start to experience symptoms of vicarious trauma, because in some way we are experiencing the trauma ourselves. So you see faces like this and you feel it in your body, you feel it in your chest and your stomach. And what's interesting is even if you don't feel it, you're still mirroring it. You're still resonating with it, even if you're blocking that. Because the interesting thing about that notion of blocking is it doesn't stop you from suffering long term. In fact, judges, attorneys, and say law enforcement officers are all trained to a degree to be able to block their experience of emotions so that they can make decisions that are not influenced by those emotions. And yet those three professions have very high incidences of vicarious trauma. So the good news is we can build resilience, but you have to be willing to engage in these practices on a day-to-day basis. Now, as I stated earlier, it's not going to stop you from experiencing vicarious trauma. The only way the research suggests to actually stop yourself from experiencing vicarious trauma is to literally take a break from being exposed. But what resilience will do is it will allow you to tolerate those symptoms. It will allow you to continue to do the work. And it all starts with this notion of mirroring. So in the same way that you mirror negative emotion, you mirror positive emotion. And this is really important to know, because what it means is you can do things like look at pictures of people smiling and laughing. Maybe they're your family members, but they don't have to be. So if you see these photographs, you feel that, don't you? It's hard not to smile when you see others smiling. And this is related to our first principle of building resilience, which is the notion of intentionally building positive emotion. Any way you can build positive emotion builds your resilience. It has to be part of your daily routine, however. You have to go looking for smiles and laughter and joy. You can't wait for it to come to you. So, for example, I now at breakfast make sure to turn on one of my two favorite sitcoms. They last about 22 minutes each, and I get to have a little chuckle, a little smile while I'm making and then eating breakfast. It's become a ritual for me. So the second is to stay connected to people you care about. The research is very clear on this, that when we build and maintain our relationships, it builds our resilience, whether that's through emails or texts or scheduled Zoom calls. I have a Zoom call every Sunday morning with friends of mine that I've known for years, because right now, for those of you who may be watching this video sometime later, right now, most of us are all working remotely. We're not allowed to have contact with friends and family, or if we are, it's very limited. So this notion of staying connected is really important. And however you do that, phone calls, emails, texts, is important to do. It's also really important that we experience nature. Now, the cool thing about this is you don't necessarily have to get out into nature. That's obviously best. But there's been research that's shown that patients in hospitals have shorter stays if they put up photos of nature in their hospital rooms. So take some time to look at pictures of nature, and that will build your resilience. And then fourth, exercise. Walk, run, ride your bike, sit-ups, push-ups, even just walk in place. Now, It's really important that this is a daily practice, and it's also just as important that obviously you consult a physician before you engage in any sort of exercise routine. And the last is to practice mindfulness on a daily basis. Now, mindfulness is simply the practice of intentionally noticing when your mind has stopped noticing, and going back compassionately to noticing. So it might be something like paying attention to this video, intentionally paying attention to the video. And when your mind wanders to dinner or a phone call you've got later today or a case, you notice that and say, wandering mind, let's go back to noticing the video and paying attention to the video. You can do it all day long and no one will notice. The science on this is really clear. There have literally now been hundreds of studies that have indicated that mindfulness benefits us. Mindfulness builds this notion of resilience. So remember, we have to practice these techniques on a daily basis. Are they going to prevent us from experiencing vicarious trauma? No, but it will make our experiences of working with traumatized individuals more tolerable. So I hope you have found this video both practical and helpful. And if you did, I want to invite you to visit www.beingti.com, sign up for our mailing list, and stay in touch. Until next time, I'm Dr. Chris Wilson, and this has been a Being Trauma Informed production.